Hey, welcome back to Console. Just a quick intro. This is a follow-up video to the previous video, so if you haven't seen the previous video, I recommend you checking that out before watching this one. This is a follow-up to the quantum computing one. This one's a little bit more philosophical, although we do kind of close the loop on some of the quantum gate related information from the previous video. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so if we pick up from where we last left off in the previous video, what we're going to talk about now is they're discussing what makes quantum computing so unique. And that is the fact that you're not able to measure the values in the qubits, right? You can, in a classical computing structure, you can measure the bit. You can take a note. Obviously, you can't really do this because the mechanisms we use in classical computing are so small, right? So you can't actually measure a bit on a classical computer, but technically you could do that. That would be theoretically possible here. What they're saying here is that isn't the case with qubits, right? Once you measure them, because it's a quantum mechanism, once you measure them, the value is gone. So you lose the information, or you could almost think of it as like discharging the bit, right? Once you've measured it, you discharge it, and all that information is now gone at that point. So they're pointing that out right here. And what they're saying is, rather than like getting a 1 or 0, what you're going to get is a probability that the qubit is in the 1 state, or a probability that the qubit is in the 0 state, right? And we talked in the previous video about like why the magnitudes of the vectors has to sum to 1. And that is because it is a probability, right? You can't go above 1, a probability 1 of some action, some position occurring, right? You either have 100% or anything in between that, right? You can't have over 100% probabilities, right? Effectively, and since that's what these qubits, that's the information these qubits are giving you, is the probability that's in a 1 or 0 position, right? They have to sum to 1 effectively. So right here they're showing you the circuit, the quantum circuit you need to construct in order to take a measurement. It's not as simple as just like running it through the wire like you would in a classical sense. You actually have to run the qubit through a NOT gate and a Hadamard gate in order to take the values here. So they're just pointing that out and kind of showing you that, illustrating it. So right here they're talking about like general quantum gates. They've shown us two particular instantiations, right? The NOT gate and the Hadamard gate. And what they're saying here is like you can construct any quantum gate you want so long as it's unitary. And unitary is, there's a big definition of that, linear algebra definition of that and all this stuff. It really just means if you multiply itself by the transpose, you get the value back. I can't remember, back when I was taking linear algebra, we had a different name for it, but in this case they're calling it unitary. So they're saying basically any unitary matrix, 2x2 unitary matrix, can be used as a quantum gate effectively. In this case, they've shown us the NOT gate, and they'll go through and do a bunch of proofs. I'm going to skip all of that, but they do a bunch of proofs to prove that the NOT gate is unitary, and also the Hadamard gate is also unitary as well. Right here, they're showing a couple other examples of unitary matrices that are quantum gates due to Wolfgang Pauli. We already saw X. There's two others, Y and Z, and Y is I, negative I and I in the matrix, and Z is 1 and negative 1 in the matrix. So they're just giving you kind of more examples. They don't use these two particular gates anywhere else in the rest of the essay, but they're motivating kind of what they mean by giving you examples of unitary matrices. And here's another one right here, right? Rotation. You've seen this one if you've ever taken trig or calculus class. Right, here's yet another one that you can use. So I mentioned at the end of the last video that we'd be talking about this in this one. So this is how you actually have qubits act on other qubits. They have a thing called a controlled NOT gate, or a C-NOT gate effectively. And what this does is it will flip the second qubit, the one below it. You can see in the circuitry, right, there's that black dot and then an open circle dot with an X in it. The qubit on the top part of that circuit will act on the bottom part of the circuit, and depending on the value in the top part of the circuit, it will either turn the bottom qubit either on or off effectively. And right here, they're just pointing out that you can combine the circuits, right? I mentioned in the previous video, like that's kind of how general computation is done on a classical computer. Is we took these gates and then we build them up together to build more and more complex logic circuits, and then eventually you're able to program on those, right? They're just saying here, like the same thing can be applied, right? You can take that Hadamard gate and apply it with the C0 gate or a NOT gate or any other, right? They can be composed together logically just like any other gates. So at this point, we're getting into the final section of the essay. We've kind of explained the linear algebra, we've explained some quantum circuits, we've explained how these quantum circuits are measured and why the values disappear once they're measured, how they're combined and how the other qubits can act on these qubits. And so now we're going to start talking about like maybe what the purposes of a quantum computer are, right? They start talking about more general quantum computing ideas. Now that they've motivated or they've taught you the basics, they're going to start talking about, okay, like what's the purpose of this? Why are we doing all this, right? One thing in particular, right, keep mentioning is like the way classical computers work is you build these bits together, these bit gates together, these logic gates together into larger and larger sums, right? And that's what they're saying here is like you can do the exact same thing with quantum gates. And so they're pointing out here like you could have 4 qubits coming in. They're all 0 basis state qubits. They run through a C0 gate, any other sort of gates. They didn't measure any of them, right? They could be any. They could be NOT gates, Hadamard gates, the X, the Y gates, right? All those. And then there's an output state at the end, right? So I keep talking about how this is like analogizes very well to classical computing, right? They're taking these same concepts and they're applying linear algebra to them effectively, right? And probabilities, right? It's not just a definite 1 or 0. There's some probability aspect related to it as well. So it's very interesting that these styles of computation are so similar, and yet there's so much hype around quantum computing, right? It seems to me like it's a very simple concept, very simple idea. Yeah, actually putting it in practice, or it might be very, very difficult, right? Like plenty of people have tried to do this sort of, Google has tried, IBM has tried, right? And it hasn't seemed to quite take off yet. They talk about later, like, you know, this is a 100-year endeavor that we're talking about at this point. But anyway, at this point, like I said, they've given you the basics, and they're going to talk about how do you compose these together and like where are we heading in the future effectively. Right here, they're going on a bit of a tangent. They probably should have put this above when they were talking about matrices. They're just saying, like, if you multiply a scalar times the identity matrix, it's often just hand waved away because it doesn't actually do anything. They're calling it here a global phase factor. It often doesn't do anything to the actual vector, the qubit in discussion, right? So it's often just factored directly out. Like you can see down here at the bottom, they say x and negative x are effectively the same thing. So they don't even bother writing an x or a negative x because it ends up having the same effect on the qubit regardless. So they're just pointing that out here. So in this section, they give you a bit of a head fake. They say, what are quantum computers good for? And then they don't tell you. And then they tell you in the next section. They're kind of using this particular section to explain, like, if you wanted to replace a classical computer. So one thing you learn when you're taking circuits in college is, like, everything can be described in terms of NAND gates or AND and NOT gates. If you really wanted to get down to brass tacks, like you could remove all the other gates, XORs, ORs, all those other things, and everything could be described in NAND gates. So what they're saying is, if you can do that, if you can replicate the AND and the NOT gate from classical computers in terms of these quantum computers, these quantum gates, then you could effectively do any computation done in a classical sense, you could do on a quantum computer, right? Which is a super powerful idea. Is if we could take all the computation we do classically and just do it on a quantum computer, which should be more efficient, which is the whole reason we're trying to do this, then that's a very good sign, right? And what they're saying is, here's how you do it. You use this Toffoli Gate effectively. That allows you to do the AND effectively, replace the AND from classical computing with the quantum gate. The similar quantum gate would be the Toffoli Gate. This is what the Toffoli Gate actually looks like. They kind of hand wave their way around it and say, basically it was discovered by running a bunch of simulations on computers. Like, we knew we needed this in quantum computing, we didn't know how we were going to get it, and somebody found it eventually, and they kind of say like, don't worry about knowing the details of this, just know that it is possible to simulate an AND gate in quantum computing, and here's how you do it. So in this next section, like I said, after they give you the head fake, they go on to really discuss like what do they think quantum computers are good for. And effectively, they've already said this in the earlier sections of the essay, which we looked at in the previous video, that they think simulating quantum mechanics is really like what these are going to be good for. They're not going to be good for replacing classical computation directly. They go in and make an argument using atoms, like medicine, studying medicine and matter and all these other things, and how quantum computing does that much more efficiently. They mention like the combinatorial explosion necessary to simulate atoms, which I do agree with them, right? Anytime I've had to do any sort of work in terms of simulation of like the real world, usually computers are really bad at that. We are doing things in terms of like machine learning that I think might help move us in that direction, but they do make a good case, I think, that this is where quantum computing really shines, and where it can really change the game if we end up achieving what we're setting out to achieve as humans, basically. Besides this simulation use case, right, the most obvious one, the one everybody knows about, is factoring, right? Prime factoring, right? Which is how cryptography works on the web right now. And so the reason why state actors are interested in quantum computing is it might allow them to break a bunch of encryption. So they're going over that one. I'm kind of happy to see that they didn't focus on that case specifically, because it's so well known. It's like the hello world or the depth first search of quantum computing. Everyone's just totally aware of what it's used for and what governments are trying to do with it. So they started the essay talking like the motivation for quantum computing was to simulate quantum mechanics, right? And right here they're questioning like, is it possible that this concept of computation could be applied to any physical system, right? Could we simulate anything in the world, right? Anything in physics, effectively, not just quantum mechanics like we're trying to do here, but can it be done for like Einstein's special theory and all these other things, right? So they're starting to get very theoretic and very philosophical at this point. Like we've discussed the nuts and bolts of quantum computing, and now we're going to start talking about the philosophy behind, physics and how it relates to computation and all these other things. So what they're saying here is kind of interesting. Again, it's very philosophical, but they're saying that the laws of physics determine what kind of computation you can do, right? And you could see that we're being limited by the laws of physics, particularly in classical computation, which is why we're trying to this new style, right? Using quantum mechanics instead. But then that circles back into like, what can we compute given this new style of computation, right? And there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the laws of physics and what we're able to simulate and compute. And they're just pointing that out here, which was very interesting, I thought. That will do it for this week's episode of Console. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the little bell if you haven't done so already. Quantum computing, it's very fascinating, interesting topic because it's looking out far into the future, right? That's always fun, I think, for everyone, especially technologists. We really like doing it. That said, I'm a bit of a pragmatist. I feel like we already have plenty of problems to solve in classical computing as it is, so I'm focusing myself on those problems, right, before I start worrying about these brand new problems that people are trying to construct with quantum computing. But that said, I'm very thankful that people are studying this right now, right? Like we wouldn't be where we are now with classical computing, which is, forget about it, right? It's magical, the things we've been able to achieve with classical computing. But we wouldn't be there now if it wasn't for people, these dreamers out there trying to do the things they're trying to do with quantum computing now, right? So it's going to be tons of years before we're actually able to see some quantum things in production that customers are able to use. but it's still a fascinating field. I was really happy to have read through some of this stuff, even though the format of the essay was a bit long and terse, kind of academic. I was still happy to get an understanding of quantum computing because I didn't have any sense whatsoever. I just tangentially from discussions with other people, like some idea of what quantum computing was, but now I myself could have a discussion with somebody else about quantum computing and be informed about what I'm discussing rather than just like relying on the information they're giving me, which, as I've said before, anything with a lot of hype behind it also has a lot of BS, right? And so the more informed you can be with those hyped subjects, I think the better off you'll end up being. That will do it for this week's episode of Console. There probably aren't going to be any more quantum episodes after this. There may be eventually in like a couple of months or something. We might look at a quantum computing programming language or something like that. Unless I release these videos and there's a lot of interest. If that's the case, then we'll keep going down this rabbit hole in quantum computing. But anyway, that's everything for now. I will see you in the next episode.